Tyler Buckhead here again for Steiner Tractor Parts. Today we're going to take a look at how to fix the steering on our John Deere Dubuque tractor with manual steering. We've got a 430W, it's a 1959 model, and it's got the shimmies. You get in 4th gear, wide open throttle, or anywhere in 5th gear on a flat surface, and the front wheels will shimmy and flutter and give you feedback through the steering wheel. When we first got this tractor, took a look at the toe end because the front left tire was wearing funny and it was wearing uneven. It turns out that the toe end, your wheels should be towed in to where they almost point toward each other just a little bit, and these are actually towed out. And it alleviated the problem of flutter in the steering, but it was very hard to steer and just didn't work very well. So we're going to take a look at how to fix these issues on the 430W that we're working on today. So as you might imagine, we've got an assortment of parts that are availability from Steiner Tractor Parts. Everything from a new worm gear, which has only recently become available. We'll also be installing the new pins that engage the worm gear as it turns. They're kind of tapered pins, then they're hardened, and they go down into the steering arm. New bearing races that go on either end of the worm. New balls for the ball bearing. New coupler for the end of the shaft where it mates up just like so. New tie rods, both inner and outer, as well as some new snap rings to retain our bearings together with the worm assembly. A new oil seal, grease seal for the steering box, as well as some parts we procured from Deere, our local John Deere dealer, some shims and bushings and so forth to address the vertical steering shaft and a few other things as well. You might also find it handy. Steiner has available, it's JD 201. It's a service manual which includes the 40, 420, 430 tractors, which all have similar steering, as well as the original service manual is SM 2019. That's something that you may seek out if you're really going to get in depth with your tractor, even beyond steering. It covers all aspects. So let's get started. All right, so we've got the sheet metal off of our 430W and found a couple surprises. Hard to believe, right? So first thing, before we've disassembled anything on the steering mechanism, the steering wheel can turn a good 3 inches at the edge of the steering wheel. This is not the original screw or bolt. It's actually like a fine thread 1/4 inch or 5/6. Looks like somebody's put 5/16 on this, but it is not tight. This is split, and as you tighten it, it clamps down onto the worm shaft itself. This is extremely loose and just sloppy. So the worm shaft doesn't appear to be too terrible, but the coupler, which we're going to be replacing, which requires some cutting and welding, splicing onto the original shaft to address that problem. So moving on to the back of the tractor, right in underneath here, and I don't know how well we'll be able to see with the video, but there's a U-joint right in there on the 430W, and your phase 3 your late model 420s will have this U-joint also, as well as like your 1010 tractors. But our U-joint is completely slopped out and wobbled out, so we're going to investigate. We may end up having a machine shop rebuild this U-joint there. I don't want to put it back together that way, because ultimately if that fell apart while we were driving, that could cause some major issues. So we want to think safety in this regard. So we're going to keep digging and getting into the front steering shaft to see what we find. But that was a preliminary observation. All right, to get our steering shaft apart, to remove it on the front end, we have a spline coupler that couples the U-joint shaft, or the short shaft, and the long one here. So we had to take roll pin punches and drive out roll pins from the, and try not to drop them on the ground, that helps too, from here. So what we'll be able to do now, in a perfect world, is to work on driving them back. It may require get this pulled off far enough. No, never mind, just fuck it. Alright, so getting our steering shaft apart may appear simple, but it is a bit of a job, or it certainly can be, especially if your parts are rusted or corroded. So what we had to do on this particular tractor, anything with the slanted dash steering wheel, so your late 420s, 430s, 440s, 1010s, they have a spline coupler here, 2 roll pins, one for the long shaft and one for the short stub shaft that's attached to your universal joint. Got to drive both of those out with roll pin punches. So we did that, and then what you have to do ultimately is take this collar and slide it back onto the long shaft. It's a much longer splined area. To do that effectively, we found we had to take our dash panel loose and use a long punch and a driver, or a hammer rather, and come through where your throttle lever was attached to drive back on this collar and push it forward. So it's a bit of a project to do that, but now that we've got that disconnected, we'll be able to pull and remove our whole steering shaft. And as you can see, this is quite a mess. Somebody had drilled this out. It had been 1/4 inch. They drilled it out to 5/16 and used a bolt, and it did not fit tight on our worm, and it actually wore excessively on the worm itself. So definitely had some issues there to address. So we'll get to work on that, and we're going to take a look in our steering box in just a bit. So what we found upon taking our steering shaft loose from the worm gear, somebody in the past had tried drilling a hole through the coupler into the worm, which they found the worm to be extremely hard. This little notch that's in the worm gear is all rounded out, and that's probably just due from being loose. The actual keyway itself is just extremely worn and wallowed out. You can maybe also see it. The pins are actually loose in the steering arm. Both pins are loose. So surprisingly, though, there's still oil in the box, which is really quite surprising to find that. Maybe somebody's replaced the seal and bushing in the past. So we're going to go to work draining the gear lube from the box and then disassembling it further. Alright, so we ended up taking out our worm gear by cheating a little bit. Technically, to get the worm gear removed, you have to go at the bottom of this steering shaft. Shaft runs from here all the way down to the bottom, and there's an arm that comes out and attaches to your tie rods. To do it in the correct order, you would go ahead and remove that the nut and lock washer from the bottom and pry loose the arm that attaches to your tie rods. We cheated a little bit by prying up on this shaft, and of course I can't do it without a pry bar. Well, there you go. You can see the shaft raises and lowers. There's some vertical play, and that's normal. That should be there. That vertical play is controlled by this little pin in the top of the cap. It's got a jam nut and a set screw on it, like so. So what we've done, and there was gear lube in the housing. We took the 3 bolts off here, took this cap off of the front, and pulled this shaft forward just enough to let the gear lube run out, and we drained it and got it cleaned out. And to remove this without removing the vertical shaft, we had to take loose this retainer clip, which goes around the shaft like so and holds the bearings in place, or the bearing race in place, and then the bearing balls come out. So we did that. The next step after this, we will be removing the steering arm at the bottom and getting this vertical shaft out and taking the tube this apart. We'll take this cast center body apart. There's bushings in here that we need to check out and make sure are in good shape. So that's the next step. So the Pneumatic Air Hammer, one of the most useful tools in my toolbox, works fabulous for breaking things loose like the tapered fit of your tie rod ends. Simply loosen up the bolt and hit it with the air impact, and they just pop right out. If you don't have this, you can use a hammer, but it's best you want to support under here with something like a pry bar before hammering. The last thing you want to do, if you hammer solely on here, you may end up breaking a steering arm and or the arm on the end of the vertical steering shaft. So something to keep in mind. So we're going to remove all this. We're going to take our axle, disassemble it, put new bushings in this area, as well as the bushing in the back. They're pretty well worn. We want our front end of our tractor tight so that when we're driving in the parade, it doesn't do anything funny. So to remove the bottom steering arm from the vertical steering shaft, we first loosen this nut at the bottom of the shaft. That's actually the end of the shaft right there. It's a nut and a lock washer, it looks like. And then we got a pry bar from either side. With the steering arm in the center position, you can get a pry bar from both sides of the tractor. And these bosses, it's almost looks like it was made to do this. Pry up, and while we employed a floor jack on the end of this pry bar, so we only had 2 people here to do the job, to keep constant pressure there. And the camera photographer on the other pry bar on the other side, I took this air hammer and up against the side of the arm, and it instantly popped loose and popped down. Once again, air hammer saves the day. If you don't have an air hammer, you're probably going to need 2 or 3 people here, and I would avoid heat. I would not put heat on that arm unless you absolutely have to. Those are straight splines, or tapered splines rather. But you could use a punch and a hammer and do the same thing, but a pneumatic hammer is far superior. So once we're going to get this nut off and release the arm, and then we'll be able to pull the shaft up and out. So we got our lower steering arm off, and as you can see, it's very fine splines, and it's also tapered. So I mean, it can be difficult, but once it pops loose, it'll pop, and all of a sudden then it should be easy going. So from here, we simply got a pry bar under the vertical steering shaft. No pry bar needed right now. And there is our steering shaft. Something to note is the severe wear on our pins. If I can hold still enough to see that. Worn on 2 sides. These pins are actually loose inside the steering arm. This one's spin all the way around. So what happens is these 2 spots are worn, and as you would steer, the angle would change and the pin would follow the groove in the worm gear. So we'll be taking these out. First thing we're going to do with a right angle grinder is grind the heads off, because they are knurled so that the pins won't fall through. There should be a press fit, but we'll have to grind that off so we can drive these pins downward, and then we'll go to reinstall the new pins. So when we went to take the main axle tube out of the housing to replace bushings, found out that there's a little retainer on the rear pin. It's into that center housing, right about like so, if you can see that. But it had been broken for a long time, almost flush with the housing. Well, the good old weld the nut to the stud trick worked. I took a 3/4 or 5/8 hex nut and welded it to the end of this with quite a bit of heat, and came out in the first try. Got lucky this time. So we'll work on getting the, whoops, don't want to drop that hot thing. We'll work on getting the front shaft, I guess you'd say, out so we can replace the bushing that's in the front of the housing. And then we'll be pulling the shaft in the back of the housing forward inside this tube so that we can take this tube out and access our seal and bushing in the main pedestal. So as you can see, we've removed both of our axles, our main center axle housing, as well as the pins that actually pivot solid with the housing in bushings carried in this casting. So we started out first by removing the 3/4 bolts, and you can always tell factory Dubuque John Deere hardware, they had a love for fine threaded bolts, so try to take care of those. Those would not be cheap should you have to replace them. So we got those removed, and then we slid each axle out individually. There's also little straps that bolt right in underneath here on the ends of your axle housing on both sides. to hold the axles up in place. Then what we did, we put a puller in the end of this shaft. It's actually threaded, and using a bolt and using this other nut as a spacer, we're able to actually tighten this up and pull the pin. Let's see, pull the pin this way. It had been sticking out like this, pulled it in far enough that it slipped out of that boss in the back. And then once we had that in place or done, we were able to take a nice long punch up through the bottom of our casting, right through the bottom. So up this way, and get at the pin at this steel spacer that's in place here, and knock it forward out of this casting, and then the casting is loose, and simply slide it to one side or the other. Take care, there are shim washers that go at the very back of our axle tube up against the housing. So the next step is to take, I've got a nice set of bushing drivers, or Seal Installer's bushing drivers, probably one of the best investments I've ever made. This is an Owatonna seal and bearing driver set. It was several $100s. It was nice. If you don't have one, you can maybe machine something. You need a driver, especially for this bushing. It's 2 1/8 inch to drive it out. So I'm going to drive it out. The old bushing is out, and we'll do the same for the rear bushing. As you can see, it was highly worn. That was at the very top. And it's also important to note on this bushing, this is actually, it's drilled on the side because you have a grease fitting right here, and there's a galley, a grease galley that goes around, and it ensures grease gets all the way around on the bushing. This one is really shot. I've seen some actually worn so bad they wore through the bushing and the steel backing as well. So just something to pay attention to. Hopefully yours hasn't gotten that far worn. If you've caught it just like we have here, it's just really thin in that area. So we'll go ahead and remove the bushing at the back of the housing, the main support housing. There is a grease seal, or like a dust cap. We'll drive it out, and as well as the bushing. And we'll install new bushings in a little bit, and go on the reassembly. So what we've done, we're going to reverse the shaft, taking up for the extreme wear in this area. The front or the rear shaft is mild steel, and we're simply going to drill a new divot and reverse the shaft. It'll be like new. The only difference is we won't have the threaded end, but that really won't make any difference. So now that we've got a slit cut on both sides of our coupler, I'm going to take a straight chisel with the idea that one of these halves should pop loose. Apparently the welding rods from the 50s are pretty, that's some decent welds. Okay. There's half of our old coupler. The other half looks like it's still solid. You can sort of see what the welding job was. So now I know where to cut. The problem was it was welded well enough originally. You didn't want to take too much material off of this. Obviously, the end of the shaft is smaller diameter for the coupler. All right, so we got our coupler off, both halves, and found out. So the way this is made is you got your shaft is a larger diameter, and the end is milled down to a smaller diameter where your coupler fits on. The challenge we have is establishing where's the bottom, so or the shoulder rather, for our new coupler to go on. There it fits on. But I'm going to take a grinder and remove all the weld slag and unevenness and try to make it nice all the way around. So we've gotten our welding out of the way and saving you the pain and agony of watching my amateur welding going on. Welded the new coupler on. This just goes to show this is not super critical, not exactly a super high strength application, not a lot of stress here, so even if your welding is subpar as mine is with the stick welder, you'll be fine. Also welded the tops of the pins to the arm. I mean, another method you could use would be heating up the tops of the steering pins and then flattening them out. But I felt like this is a much more secure way of doing it. Plus, heating may swell it and keep the pin from getting loose in there, but it may not stop the pin from wanting to rotate as the originals did. Where welding them solid to the arm will eliminate any possibility of those pins moving once again. We don't want them moving in the bore. On another end of the steering shaft, before the paint and crud was, it made it really hard to slide this coupler, so we took a wire brush on a right angle grinder. You can just take a straight wire brush and just clean up the splines, make it so that it's much easier to install. So this is a view from the top of our steering front end support, looking down at the hole where the bushing and lip seals used to be. We just got done removing them, but that's a little difficult to show. So this surface and that bushing, it's deceiving in the video. There's about, I would say 11 inches from that hole to this hole, which makes installing a bushing from the top going to be a little bit tricky. We're going to try it. Another method that might be used is to use a threaded rod to pull the bushing up from the bottom into the bore and then install the seals afterwards. Of course, the seal on the top is going to be the trickiest one. Thankfully, John Deere, somebody at Deere thought, it's hard to see in the video, but the top edge of this bottom hole is tapered. There we go. We can see that. It's tapered to help you line everything up as you're going to install the seal versus just coming out flush and having a square edge. So what we did to remove this is, here's the old bushing and one of the lip seals. You can see how thin it is. It's probably an 3/16 of an inch, 1/8 inch tall. There's a lip seal on the top of the bushing, like so, and then there's also one at the bottom as well. Also on both sides of the bushing, there was a lip seal. So what we did to remove them, on the bottom, we came up from the bottom of the housing, underneath here, you can kind of see down from the bottom, using a screwdriver, and we just got in above between the seal and the bushing and just pried down and prying the seal out. And then on the top seal, we came up with the screwdriver at an angle and just gently pushed up. These seals come out by hand. They're very fine, and you don't need drivers or anything fancy to remove them. And just pop the seal loose on the top. And then we took one of our bushing drivers, and this one is 1 inch and 7/16, and we installed that. Actually, is the next size smaller, so it'd be 1 inch and 3/8 is the one that we used. And then from the top, we drove the bushing down with the help of this driver until it fell out of the bottom, and it really didn't come out very, very hard, thankfully. So we were curious as to how deep the bore is for the bushing and the seals, because the bushing and the seals, when you stack them up, they measure approximately 1 inch and 3/4. But after measuring with our super high-tech measuring device, it is also known as a small punch, we have about 2 1/4 inches to work with. So we've got an extra 1/2 inch overall to work with to install this, meaning we just need to get that bushing roughly centered into the bore, and we have a little bit of leeway one way or the other. So we'll drive it down, and we want to get the bushing installed from either top or bottom of the bore, say within 1/4, no closer than 1/4 inch either way at the maximum. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the bushing in first, put it in and check for fit. We're going to drive it down from the top in our method. The other method you might use is a piece of threaded rod. You can use the factory washer. This is kind of the middle spacer that we took out of here initially. You can use that. and thread it all thread and kind of pull the bushing up from the bottom into the bore would be another method. But we're going to challenge ourselves to see if we're able to drive the bushing down in with the bushing driver. We found an axle sleeve off of a John Deere plow. So if you have a John Deere 44 wheel axle, we'd be able to borrow the bushing or the bearing sleeve from that to work with our driver set. So I've already started my bushing down in the bore with my driver like this. Smeared grease all over everything so the bushing stick and held to it. And my driver, unfortunately, is just long enough to get started. But as you see, it only goes in there so far. So using my fancy John Deere wheel bearing or some sort of a bushing to keep things lined up, this actually just fits. It's from a John Deere 44 plow. We've got everything lined up. I'm going to use another pin as I drive. Very fancy. And I should be, that's as far as I can go with my spacer that I put on. Okay. Now with this, our bushing is just centered up, is just below the taper, but not far enough. It's just below the taper. You can see kind of on this edge, so we're going to want to drive it down in there just a little bit further. The nice thing is I can come from the bottom and I can feel, oh, we've got a good inch to go yet. That's how much on my finger I've got to go. So we're going to get that down in there further and try to get it centered. Then ultimately we're going to check with our shaft and check for fit. We may have to size the bushing. So we've driven our bushing down into the bore. It's down in the bore approximately 3/8 to 7/16 of an inch. Plenty of room for us to install our seal. But before I install seals, I want to check the fit of our shaft, because I need to know if we're going to have to ream or hone the bushing. So cleaned up the end of the shaft. We're just going to gently slide it in place by itself just to make sure. Yeah, you don't want any binding. If you have to force something, stop, don't do it. But yeah, we've even got a little bit of play, which is fine, because there's got to be some give. So yeah, we have no issues rotating the steering shaft as it will be rotating in like so. So we know we're good there. Now we can work on installing our seals. So I've installed my seal on my driver set. I'm using a driver to drive the seal down is 1 3/8 inches, and the actual driver is 1 1/8 inches is the diameter of our shaft. So I've got everything lubed up real nice. It's kind of a booger to install the seal. We're going to install this seal with the lip facing upward and away from our bushing, because its job is to keep dirt and dust and whatnot away. And you notice I've lubed everything up. So the idea is this goes inside of our bushing, pulls it down, lines everything up, and then I'll be able to drive our seal in very carefully. Feel like everything is lined up good, good in this case. There we have it. Our top seal is installed. See if we can zoom in on that. Alright, so here we are with a shorter driver. We've got it started in from the bottom. I'm just working on getting everything up and flush into the bore. would appear like it's so hard to tell when working from this angle if everything is going in straight. There, that feels more like it. Looks like our seal is installed. Has a little bit of room in under the bushing. Remember, and we're installing both of these seals with the lips facing outward so that they keep dirt and grease and dust away. You know, there's no way to grease these after they're installed, so we're going to smear a bunch of heavy, good quality grease in there so that when we stick the steering shaft down in, we're in excellent shape. So we've installed our spacer, and this essentially is just a big flat washer that goes between the support housing and our casting up here. Notice that there is a machine bushing here, or a hollow dowel for make sure everything is aligned and true. Put a little bit of grease on that. Alright, work on setting everything into place, and it does fit tight, but as you want it to. And all of our bolts are the same length. So we'll simply reinstall those and tighten them up, and then we'll work on our steering gearbox housing up at top. So we've already removed our grease seal from the old grease seal, and I've already begun to drive the bushings downward from the top using my bushing driver set. Put them in a vise, and the way our bushings were installed inside, you've got a bushing on top, bushing on the bottom, seal down below, and then there's a space in the middle, and the space, the gap, is there to allow oil. There's a hole in our gearbox to allow oil to get down and lubricate both of these bushings. You'll also notice these bushings they have galleys, one on each bushing, that's milled inside. I don't know if you can see that very well, to allow grease and oil to get around the shaft. So there's our first bushing. And our second bushing. Well, there we have it. Now we'll go work on reinstalling them. So here we are installing the bushings the same way we drove them out, except I'm going to install each bushing from opposite sides to leave the gap in the middle. There's a hole right here that is drilled crossways in the bore that will go between the bushings, so it's important we don't drive this one too far and block that hole. That'll allow oil and grease to get down and lubricate the lower bushing. So we're just going to drive it flush with the top of the housing. Maybe just a little bit further. I can see through the hole just to make sure. There we go. All right. So that's installed, and we'll flip it over the flat part of our workbench, and we will install. Got to do some cleaning first. Somebody used some silicone on the old one. I don't know if the seal didn't seal as well as it should have, or what the case was. I am not a fan of silicone in most applications on antique tractors, but to each their own. Alright, always grease up the bushing. Oil or grease, any lubricant. Take your pick. You can also use a hydraulic press for this if you want to get fancy. Looks like we're right where we need to be, flush with the bore for our seal. And here's our grease seal. It's important to install our seal with the lip facing the oil to keep everything. That may have been why the silicone was on it, since I could just push that seal into place. That would be why the silicone was on. In this case, we may have to use some sort of a sealer to promote the seal staying in place. Not that it can go anywhere, but you sure don't want it coming loose over time. You can go show. So I've saved us time. We went ahead and greased up the race so that as I drop the bearing balls in, they stick in place on the race. It's a good idea to do this over a table or some other solid surface, so when you can expect to drop some of these, they don't go flying all over your shop and go missing. Okay, so we've got that in place. And we can put our retainer, get that into position. Could use a and it just holds it into place so it can't go anywhere. We'll do the same thing on the other end. We already preloaded some of the balls. We're going to try another method. Preloaded some of the balls on the race, but not all. And that worked pretty well. And I'll do that in the same fashion, same manner. Retainer clips are pretty stiff, but so there we have it, our new worm with new balls ready to go into our housing. So we wanted, before I install our steering shaft down into the housing with the new bushings, I wanted to check play. If you go to install the steering shaft and the bushings were to be too tight and deformed, you'd have to size the bushings. And the way we size bushings, this is actually a brake cylinder hone that we would actually needs a couple stones. Looks like they're about ready to come off. But a brake cylinder hone is about the only thing you can get that goes small enough. If you need to get in and hone the bushings, you just put them on just a small drill. Could be a cordless or corded drill. But the biggest trick there is less is more. You don't want to take too much material off, so you just you would always use lots of lubricant. Penetrating oil is what I like to use. You only want to take off the material you have to take off. In this case, it was fairly tight. The steering shaft was fairly tight early on. I did not use any tools to install this. I did everything by hand, took time to lubricate and so on as I was installing. But what I wanted to do is get everything down to where this is going to be sitting and check play. It's tight, it's snug, but there's no resistance. So we're not going to have to hone these bushings, and if everything goes right, you shouldn't have to hone them, but just be mindful that it may be something that will be required, depending, especially if the bushings got even just a half of a thousandth or a thousandth of an inch. Something else to keep in mind: our steering shaft was not scored in the area where it rides on the bushing, but if the steering shaft in your tractor would be scored here, you're going to want to clean that up, dress it up with some fine grit emery cloth, something like this material, 120 grit or maybe even 240, but not sandpaper, actually emery cloth. if you have to do that, to polish it and take out any rough edges that might be in there. So we'll go ahead and install our worm. We've already got it pre-assembled with the balls in place. We've got our new oil seal on the, or grease seal on the other end. And notice we're doing this off the tractor. We're going to install this all as one assembly. Okay, there is our worm in place, and as we need to lubricate here, and actually in this case I'm just going to use some spray grease for the time being, just some lithium grease, and go ahead and install these. You can kind of see how they work. And make sure everything goes smooth from one side to the other. Alright, so we've assembled our gearbox. We had a couple issues. We had to chase the threads inside this coupler, which is a 1/4 28. It's a fine thread. We also had to source this bolt, or this cap screw. It's an Allen head screw. It's 1 1/8 long, and it's 28 threads per inch. So if you have to source it at a hardware house, or whether you can actually still purchase that from Deere if you need to buy it, they still source it. That's where ours came from. We've also had to make a shim gasket for our front steering because we put new balls and changed the balls races and changed the steering worm. We had to add shims out here. The original equipment stuff is available with 2, 3, and 5,000 shims. Ended up making ours out of some heavy cardstock paper. Seal that up with Indian head shellac. That's what I like to use there. We should have just right at 0 end play on that worm to make it right. We've filled our box about to the bottom third of the worm with 140 weight Gear Lube. I like to use the heavier stuff. You could probably get by with an 85-90 weight Gear Lube as well, but it literally just takes a few ounces. You don't want to overfill this. As long as the worm picks up enough oil to bring it up, you're in good shape. You'll notice, and you can't necessarily see it from the top view, but as you steer your gear through the range, the shaft and the pins ride up and down throughout the range of motion, and that goes back to the design overall. It's a little stiff when this peg first starts to hit the worm, and that's one of those things that'll just have to be seated in and broken in when over time as we get to using it. So we're going to go ahead and put our top cover on, and we'll assemble this all as one unit on our tractor. So we've got our steering shaft and our gearbox, both of our shafts installed. We're going to go ahead and try to set this down in. I've lubricated everything in the I've lubricated the whole shaft so everything just fits down nicely, and I feel like we're in good shape. All right, now we'll tighten our bolts, and we can align our coupler and put our steering wheel back on, and then get to work on reassembling the axle. So we've got our steering shaft back on, we've installed our roll pins in our coupler, and put our steering wheel back on. And we are going through and adjusting the limiter, if you will. Basically, as your steering arm goes left to right, it goes up and down in various spots in your worm, and you've got to set the limit so that you don't have any tight spots, but you also don't want it too loose. We'll try that. Shouldn't have any catches in through the range of motion. There's just one little spot where I can feel it, but it's not enough that I want to adjust it any looser. This will wear in, and you may find when everything seats in together, you may have to adjust this at some point in the near future on your tractor as you use it a little bit. Ultimately, you don't want any shimmy in your front wheels while you're driving down the road. So we'll set it up this way for now, and we may have to make a final adjustment at the very end. Alright, so since there's not exactly a mark on the steering shaft or the steering arm, we've got to figure out where center is. Because this is a multi-spline shaft, there's different positions it can be in. What I found is on our 430W, and it may be different for your tractor, but there's approximately from left to right all the way is approximately 4 complete turns of the steering wheel. So if you divide that in half, you start it all the way on the left side and try to center it up, and guess where your arm should go. It's one of either one or the next position on the splines. And then just loosely put your shaft up on the splines and turn it all the way right or left. And there's marks on the casting. This arm actually should stop here and over on the other side. You'll see marks on your arms where it actually stops and it hits it physically. It's not, the stop is down here. It's not up in your steering box. It's down here. So if you're off a notch, your arm will not contact one side, but will contact the other side. So you know it's right when you turn all the way to the left, it contacts, or all the way to the right, it contacts here. All the way to the left, it contacts here. As long as you have contact at both extremes, you know that you're in the right spot. Then you can reinstall your steering arm. It's also important to note that your steering arm, well, these are tapered splines, so you really can't put it on wrong, but you just to save some grief, there's an offset downward in your steering arm for your tie rods hook in, so that your nuts can clear this casting here. So we'll go ahead and tighten this up, get it good and snug. Then we'll be ready to reassemble our axle. Alright, so now we are installing our axle center housing back in the support. And previously, all the wear on your pin bushing is on this top edge. So this was the top edge, and you can kind of see there's several thousandths of wear. And what we're going to do is rotate this 180. I drew a paint mark arrow to know which way should be up. So our pin, well, they call this I guess a stub shaft, our pin. It's not bad enough to warrant replacement, but you know, if you had a machine shop, you could make your own. But in this case, we're going to improvise. The hardest part is getting it in there just right. I think we're pretty close. Yeah, I think we bottomed it out. And there's actually a bolt that goes in through here. A bolt with washers. I'll have to retrieve that in a moment. Put it in. The next thing we'll have to do, we'll have to come from the side. We'll take a shot of that. So we've got our rear pivot pin installed. And essentially the pin, to install the axle housing, you had to slide the pin all the way forward, flush with the end here, into the housing. And you got everything lined up. There's actually a dimple in the pin. We've sharpened the end of a bolt in this case because we didn't have the correct bolt. The original Allen head set screw and as a tapered pin broke off when we tried to remove it initially. So we put this in. We already had the front in place, as you saw earlier. We installed a couple extra shims in here between this support and the center housing. And ultimately, we've got a little bit of play, but not enough. We couldn't get another shim washer in, and it took 2 people. That's not an easy process, because as you do this, you have to actually pry. The end of this pin will be sticking out here, and with a pry bar, you kind of have to slide it rearward as it goes through each of the shims, and it's tough to keep everything together and lined up. But we got it done with the help of 2 people. I apologize we couldn't get it on video because your videographer was my helper. So, but we've got everything into place. This pin stays solid with the center housing and pivots into bushing here that we installed earlier. So we'll grease everything, but much tighter than it was. You'll probably find on your tractor that with a wide front end, very similar circumstance. So as you can see, we've got our axles back in the main axle housing. It's not a very easy job to do by yourself. Once again, seek help from a buddy. The one thing you want to do is figure out which axle is in the front and which is in the back. Not that it probably makes a whole lot of difference at the end of the day, because I mean your tie rod length is still going to be equal, or more or less equal. Your adjustment procedure is still going to be the same, but we try to put everything back the way we took it apart. Ours is set out to a width that the ends of this axle does not come all the way out to here. It actually comes right here. There are spacer blocks inside the ends on both sides. Here you can see that better. There's a spacer block right there. Looks like we got that in there. There, we'll square that up. Notice the spacer blocks has a gap that matches up against the axle the way it's designed, so pay attention to that. Then there's 3 bolts that hold everything together. The 2 outer bolts, then your center bolt that goes through the pivot pin. It goes all the way through, and there's a slot at the bottom of this main housing for you to get a wrench up in there. Impact wrenches are very handy for that 1 1/8" bolt head. So, moving on to the next topic, we've got our tie rod ends off, and we've got some play in these. They're not completely shot, but while we're here, we're going to go ahead and put some new stuff on. Sneak over here. So we've got the original, and we've got the brand new one from Steiner Tractor. We'll reinstall back in the same spot. One thing I'll mention, this was very well rested in there. We didn't get any heat involved from a torch just yet, but it was getting to that point. What I did is I put this in a vise, the tie rod, and I taking a large adjustable wrench on the head of the tie rod end. We got it to twist out of there. The best luck I've always had are twisting out of there. The other thing we could have tried is removing this end and pulling this tube out and taking it and trying to drive it from the other end. But when you do that, you risk mushrooming the end of this and making it nearly impossible to get out. So something to keep in mind. If you have to and you can't get it out, you probably want to disassemble the whole mechanism, and then you could heat the tube and then try to twist it out would be my suggestion, trying to twist it out. Just take care you get a 24-inch crescent wrench and you can twist this off. Then you've really got a problem to deal with. Another trick I'll advise is do one tie rod at a time so you have something to look at as a reference. We're going to do this one. I'm going to set it back up and make it look identical to this in the way that it's all the orientation of the various parts. So it's just helpful for later. So we'll do both, and then we'll come back after it's installed and we'll check our toe in. I almost forgot to mention, on Reassembly, anti-seize lubricant on our new tie rod end, because since the originals were never done. In case you get a unique implement or have a need to adjust the wheel tread on your tractor, you'll thank me later for having done this a few years down the road. Before you do this, I've got a pipe cleaner that works just perfect to get in there and get all that rust out. I've done that 5 or 6 times, so we're cleaning everything up. I'll also remind you, for reassembling the axles into the housing, I took a wire brush on the end of my 4-inch grinder, like so, and I cleaned up all the surfaces on the sides where everything comes together. Just removing that coating of rust makes assembly so much nicer. The outer tie rods moved rather easy, but when it comes to these inner tie rods, they don't get moved very often. And this one sort of appears like it's been bent. But once you can get them turning and twisting, then it gets a whole lot easier. Almost there. Victory. Victory is always good. Back to the pipe cleaner. Oof. Probably been in there since 1959. All right, there it goes. I guess we can go ahead and install the. Go ahead and install the new one back in. One might have to wonder if something is bent. Doesn't appear like that. Certainly possible. Well, the other one came out, so it couldn't have been too far off. Get everything lined up. Put a little anti-seize on our locking screw, jam screw. We'll tighten that. Don't look, I'm not using the proper tool. That happens in my shop on occasion. Let's get that nice and snug. And snug up the jam nut with a 1/2-inch wrench. All right. We've got both of our tie rods ready to go, and we're going to install them on the tractor. So we checked toe in, and which is basically the easiest way to check toe in. First off, I've got my wheels jacked up. I spun both wheels to make sure that I don't have a bent or wobbly wheel. If you have a bent or wobbly wheel, you are going to have a difficult time checking toe in accurately. Ultimately, what you want is you want the wheels to toe in 1/2 or 1/4 to 1/2 inch in the front versus the back. So we were at 59 inches in the back, and we were at 58 1/4 in the front. So we were at 3/4 inch toe in, which is a little excessive. It probably would have worked, but at 3/4 inch toe in, we may start to notice excessive wearing on the ribs of our front tires. So what I'm going to try is shortening the tie rods. By shortening the tie rods, I bring the toe. I minimize the toe in the front. I basically bring the back wheels together more than the rest. So we're going to try this and see where we're at. I still got to do the other side. Tie rods are just a little bit stiff yet. You notice the steering is just a little bit stiff, but with some use it will loosen up and steer very easily like it once did. We notice there's no shimmy or shake. It steers even to the left and the right with no excessive binding. So I think we fixed the problem. We'll do a double check once over, make sure everything is good and tight again. That we didn't forget to tighten up a bolt or something like that. And then we'll throw the hood back on and we'll be ready for the parade.